Hey guys, welcome to Game Art Questions and Answers, where I take my experience as a game artist and answer questions inside of our Discord. Today we have lots of interesting questions. For example, base meshes versus sculpting, when to use them and when not to use them, some difficulties when it comes to 2D concepts that you would receive in the industry, and also how to solve those problems. Quite advanced topics on rigging and blend weighting. So for example, those who are using trim sheets and trim floating objects, how do we all integrate that onto a rigged mesh? How to get wobbly organic UVs and square them off, and the benefits of doing that and when not to do that. My top tips for making optimal high polys so it doesn't adversely affect the rest of your workflow chain when it comes to unwrapping, UVing and baking. And finally, questions on optimization versus quality. What should you actually be putting inside your portfolio? And from my perspective as an art director, what I'm looking for in those portfolios. So enjoy the video, and as you watch, if any more questions come up, do post them in the monthly questions and get featured on next month's video. So our first question comes from Rishab, and it's a really good question because it can be the difference between getting a job in the industry and not. They ask what I prefer to use on personal projects, so a base mesh or starting from a sphere, and was wondering if it's justifiable to use a base mesh for projects or start from that sphere and focus on other aspects. So it's a really strong topic. There's definitely, I can dive deep into that, give you my 2 cents from hiring in the games industry and also teaching loads of university students. I see base meshes and people starting from scratch, and it does affect how employable you are. So for those who are unaware, in character art and in the games industry, sometimes we can use something called a base mesh. So as you imagine on AAA, we don't start from scratch every single time because that's going to waste a lot of time, lots of resources, and basically your end product is going to be more expensive. But that can throw some confusion in when you are working and practicing for yourself. You know, the temptation is always there to use a base mesh and start from it. And definitely at university, I see potentially about 60 to 70% of people try and use base meshes for their submissions. Even at the start of lectures and the start of terms, I have to warn them not to do it, obviously because it's a form of plagiarism, but also they're just not getting the learning that they could be getting at becoming a better character artist. And the problem is when you're looking for a job, art directors are looking at your portfolios, we can see those base meshes. I've seen all of them. And especially with the advent of these new courses, all the courses use the same base meshes. So you can really see the people who have the skills that are needed for those jobs and the people that don't. So to answer your question, you really have to split yourself into 2 categories. Are you the professional that's getting paid and who's already done some things like sculpting of characters? Then you ideally do want to use a base mesh because, you know, you'll be spending less time at the desk and it's not so important. But I've seen a real shift in submissions for people who are applying to be character artists. And I see what I call the Buckaroo effect, is where they get a base mesh and then decide that they're putting clothes and stuff. But when you start to interview them and then look at their actual skills, they really don't know how to sculpt things. And that's important as a character artist because you might need to sculpt all manner of things like creatures or make slight adjustments. Imagine if you're looking for a chef for your kitchen, for example. Do you want the person who can make it from scratch, make it taste really good, understands all the flavors? Or do you want someone who's just putting the little finishing garnishes on here and there? So there's multiple pros and cons to it. So whether to use a base mesh or sculpt is a broad range depending on different scenarios. So the best way to approach this is basically do a pros and cons table for each. And then you can extract out where you lie on this sort of curve. And I'll also tell you what the optimal sort of strategy is for approaching this. So by the end, you definitely know, or at least can feel good if you are using or not using a base mesh. So the first benefit is that you can save time. So the one everyone obviously knows is there's no sculpting up cost. But also at the same time, when you're using base meshes, we have a standardized UVs and also standardized subtools or subdivisions. So in the games industry, we'll often use both of these on one individual character. And then that means we also save time when it comes to UVing, and we can use certain things like clothes and textures. So when you are in the industry, usually you get given a base mesh and then you work from that. But the question Rishab had was basically, do you introduce this into your own sort of workflows, especially for something like a portfolio? So the opposite of saving time is it's basically a massive con and a bit of a trick when you are learning. And what I call it here is a false sense of glory. So while you're working really hard and sculpting things and they're not coming out as good as they could be or as others look on ArtStation, you'll see people next to you who are using base meshes. They're posting it on social media and they're getting loads of likes, so it starts to look good. And it's especially a trap on these courses where you get given a base mesh and then start to buckaroo assets on top of there. And the primary purpose for that really is to make the person who's teaching kind of look good at the end of the day. But a little fall off from that is the person or the student that's learning really doesn't get the skills that are needed for getting a job. So when one of these portfolios are taken to an art review, or say, for example, I'm looking at somebody's work they're applying for either a contract role or a position, then we can really see that they have started to use these base meshes. And then what it communicates to me is like, right, okay, they don't understand how to start from scratch, and therefore they don't know how to complete the tasks that I would have for them. So it's really one of these things where you have to stay resolute in why you're doing things and why you're learning, and try and avoid that base mesh trap, basically. So from that, the major pro from sculpting is that you become better, but more importantly than that, you become better than everyone else in comparison. You also gain the ability to solve any sculpting problem, and so therefore become a more valuable artist. So say all these complex creatures and animals, if you're only used to moving the vertices around a base mesh, you're not going to be able to understand how to create advanced things like horns and skulls and wings and anything that's basically required for such a character. Or even when it comes to doing things like scarring and quite advanced anatomical changes, you're going to be left in the dark because you're only used to using a base mesh. So the cons of starting from a sphere and sculpting, obviously it's a longer journey, but you and I both know that in terms of short-term and long-term, people that go for the long-term things usually survive longer or get more advantages from that. And another con, as you're sculpting, it's going to look not very good. So you're going to have lower quality start, and your portfolio pieces aren't going to look that good. So it's basically more of like an ego trip, to be honest. But you can flip that on its head, and whenever you produce something that isn't, fantastic, that's an opportunity to improve. And when you do improve, you become more hireable, and then that basically leads to your dream job. So that leads to the optimal strategy for you guys to succeed the best you can inside of the industry. So the first is to avoid Mr. Potato courses. So those ones where you just create little assets and then put them on top of a base mesh. And to stop you from going to the short term, create 3 portfolio characters, something that you start from scratch. And then once you've completed those and they're kind of looking good, then you can start to transfer to using base meshes and becoming more efficient as an industry artist. And the third phase to that is to basically practice wrapping. So that's what we use in the industry. So once you've covered those 2, that leads nicely to this one. So one of the problems with the Mr. Potato courses is that those base meshes have the ghost. No matter how many changes you do, you sculpt on it, you make all those individual movements, you can still really see the underlying base mesh. And from someone who's received so many portfolios and reviewed them, it's amazing how I can see the original base mesh inside of those characters. I can't explain it. I would have to sort of like collate them all and you'd be able to see it, but it's really, really evident, and it's super evident when in university because everyone thinks that they can sort of like trick it past. The 3 portfolio characters, that's going to upskill you, and it's going to make sure that you're focusing on the good things like long-term stuff. And then with the practice of the wrapping, you can create something from scratch, and then we would use the base mesh to wrap it back onto your original. So we get all the advantages across the board of practicing, becoming a better artist, but then also saving time in the sense of our UVs and our textures and be able to switch characters out. So next question is from the one and only Ryan Gosling. And what they're doing is they're focusing on a portfolio piece after doing some client work. So congratulations on that client work. Yeah, really good idea to start personal projects. You can start to flex things that aren't shown in your primary work. Seems you've started on this asset and then we're following the video that I made on how to start an asset and break it down into individual shapes and then combine that into ZBrush so you can get really, really accurate. So for those who are interested in that video, it's the reference tricks that can be found on the channel. It is a members video, but I highly suggest if you are interested in watching all those videos, there's hundreds of hours of content to catch up on. And obviously you can ask these questions. So it's a really good question. It's totally understandable, especially in smaller teams. You might not even have a concept artist. And when you do have a concept artist, they don't necessarily give you the nice layouts that help the games artist create, our front and side views. So as an artist, you need to get used to the skills of interpreting what you do see in the concepts and then trying to work that out inside of 3D. So with yours specifically, obviously they're quite turned to the side, so it's hard to see what's on the front and back. So as a character art, I suggest really practicing drawing your own 2D layouts. Obviously, no one's going to really shout at you for not matching it pinpoint perfectly. Obviously, we covered techniques in order to get the right proportions and make it look like the character. But obviously, when we're doing T pose and A pose, we can't achieve that perfectly. So off to the side, what I suggest doing is just drawing something that's fairly closely. It doesn't have to be pretty. It's just for your own observations. And then you can transfer that into your sculpt. And then when you do get into AAA stuff, you will be provided with a front and side view. And that's just because when there are so many different artists, animators, programmers working on a project, it is more convenient for us to have these front and side views. But also at the same time, don't be worried that you're missing them, because they can be quite frustrating at times, especially when you're an artist and you know how to improve the model, but you're really restricted to the front and side views. Also, at the same time, you were looking for a portfolio review. So a really good time to do that. What I'll do is I'll put it on the next feedback progressive video, so I can really give the time to like dive in here and make it perfect. So I had a very quick look and there's loads of suggestions that I have on this one. And it's nice to see that your portfolio is taking shape here. So the next question is from Clocked, and it's a really good one based on rigging a character and how to integrate things like trims and loose geometry on a component. So it's an advanced one, but it's also very good because it's thinking about the full production chain for characters. So if they had to rig and animate the character themselves, it's easy to rig it if there's less loose geometry components. So that's definitely true, but we also lose a little bit of trim functionality. And then on the converse side, as you were saying, if it's already part of the garment and it's all integrated, very similar to like you would see with nails on a character, which we covered in previous videos, then it can make things a little bit more easy, but also at the same time, there are some disadvantages. So we can go through those. So with game characters, obviously, the character that we send to an animator, it's their job to weight paint certain parts of the mesh onto a bone system so it can start to move around. So the problem is that can sometimes add some forms of complexity. So for example, if we were weight painting a fish, that's very easy because it's one seamless continuous mesh and we can just start to deform and warp it. And then it gets a little bit more complicated with advanced characters. And usually the solution is to add loads of intricate bones, and especially have a good animator, they're going to be able to solve that. So if you imagine a low poly asset like this, we've obviously got some floating belts and buckles. Now, if you were weight painting that, depending on how much it's moving with the bone, sometimes these can accidentally overlap into each other and hit each other, and it can be a little bit of chaos. So sometimes what we can do is integrate it all together. So if you look on this character, for example, we don't have a floating pocket on the backside because that's going to be quite annoying. And they've even combined certain bits together. It's most evident on the really low poly stuff. So you can see this is all one mesh, but it all looks like separate individual components. So in games, we do want to keep this as efficient as possible, but there are lots of benefits when it comes to rigging. Now, with your specific example, we can give it a breakdown. So the reason you've decided to have this as floating is that we can take advantage of trim meshes. So there's kind of like infinite texture detail, something that's often used on AAA games like the Order 1886. If you want high fidelity stitches or zips and things like that, then this is the way to go. We create floating geometry that shares the same sort of UV space. But now obviously that introduces a bit of a problem. We've now got this floating piece of geometry that's going to be difficult to weight paint. You know, as the character starts to move, imagine this character twists their torso, then all of this is going to fly all over the place. Now, usually what I say with these things in the torso region, this is usually a region on characters that doesn't deform that much. So the only thing we really have is a little bit of twisting. That's probably the most complex. But in the general sense, this tends to stay quite static, almost like they're wearing some sort of body armor. So it's probably less of an inhibition than you think. Now, the ultimate solution and how I'd basically approach this is you want to integrate this trim all as one individual mesh. So it's going to involve adding a little bit extra geometry, you know, some triangles that are going to be flying out and then connecting back onto each other. But the thing is, you're going to get the advantage of seamless sort of like animations. So there's going to be no problems there. And there's quite technical ways we can still achieve this trim. We just have to be really smart with extracting this off the UV. So imagine you've got this low poly, and then this area is the integrated mesh that you've done, but also at the same time you want it to be a tileable trim sheet. So the UV would look something like this when you unwrap it. So you've got the full seamless integrated mesh, and then you've got this inside section. What your job will be is to cut all of this out and then lay it out nicely on the UV, maybe on the top or even on a separate UV trim sheet. So you basically get the best of both worlds. So I appreciate that's a bit of an advanced technique. And for newcomers, it might be a little bit overwhelming there, but that's the beauty of game art. There's so much to learn there. So that leads on to the next question quite well. And this is from Shu. So it's how to achieve squared straight UVs, just like we were talking about with the trim sheet on organic objects. And also how to prepare hairs on long hair without stretching the textures. So really good questions here. And also, is it better to do a damage pass on a high poly or in the textures? So really good core fundamentals there. Okay, so for the people that aren't familiar, whenever you're unwrapping an organic, say it's like the pelt of an animal or it's a t-shirt or even a face, you're going to have this wobbly unwrap. And that can sometimes be frustrating, especially if we want to put squared patterns on there. So say, for example, like denim texture, or you can see down here, there's a very specific pattern that is needed and we need nice straight UVs to let that work. Also on high polys, when it comes to hard surface, we do like to have straight edges just because it bakes better with infinite pixel density, but that's a different video. Now your question was when you do these organic unwraps is basically how do you make them nice and square? As a general rule of thumb, this is going to be common amongst most packages. What you'll be doing is trying to straighten up the outermost edges. So basically you would select all of these vertices or basically like UV vertex. Then you would use an align feature that just makes them all nice and straight. And then depending on what package you use, we can then pin all of these UV sets and verts on there. So once those are pinned, it means they're not going to move. And then the next option is to select all the ones at the bottom, and then you're going to be using your relax function. So when you do that, nothing on the pin side is going to move and all these are going to relax and they're going to be as straight as they physically can. And then it's your job to go back over and then just straighten up the edges. So that's basically the full workflow of how you relax something that's organic. Drop a message in the Discords if you want me to basically cover this kind of workflow, because again, that's another in-depth video in order to do that. But that's the overall view that will work in Maya, Blender, and basically any sort of UV thing. So your next question was, how do you prepare hair cards, stuff like this, for long hair without stretching the UV cards? So it's totally understandable. You know, you've got a UV layout that looks a little bit something like this. And because the UV space is only squared, when it comes to super long hair, you know, obviously we're going to have to stretch that texture. So the simple answer is that it's inevitable and there's no way really to avoid it. But also at the same time, we've got to remember that when we are stretching textures, that's completely fine as long as it doesn't look bad. So there's slight considerations you have to make when you're creating these hair clusters in anticipation for that stretch. So say, for example, you were making some hair cards and they had loads of little wobbly strands that are kind of like this. When it comes to stretching it, obviously these wobbles are going to be elongated. So those are the considerations. For long hair, what I usually like to do is keep the hair strands really nice and flat and straight like this. And then with the geometry, we can make the decision of how it wants to bend and weave. Now, I don't want to get too carried away. There are some advanced techniques where we can basically look at the center of the asset, a bit like an IMM you would see in ZBrush, and then we can infinitely duplicate this and then just have unique root ends and unique root tips. But to be honest, it's really not worth it, and the use case is very, very rare unless we're going for something like dreadlocks that have kind of like a tied end or something with a different color or vertex colors. But as a general rule of thumb, you shouldn't worry too much about stretching. We actually do use it a lot in the games industry. Okay, so another part of your question was, how do you better do a damage pass on a high poly, or do you leave it to the textures? So this is something you really pick up from experience while baking, but I can describe it to you and sort of like how I look and approach it. So there's a character sculpt that I've found on Google Images here. I think it's on Polycount. And this is quite a good example of refraining from putting too much damage and detail in the sculpt, because when we take it to texturing, it's much better to texture and add details when you can inside of a texturing package, because it offers up so many more options for changing the specularity, the roughness, any sort of height information, and just customizing it in general. Even for characters, when we're doing paws and skin detailing, often I very rarely put that into the sculpt because I want to see it popping out inside of the texture and see how it looks in the final game render. So when you do put details into a sculpt, you've got to remember there's no going back from that. So once it's come into Substance Painter, you're not going to be able to change those details. You're basically stuck with what you've got. And it also really dirties your bake and just makes it really noisy and disgusting. So here's a really good example. They've used sculpting detail where it counts. So for example, on the belt, you'll see that there's very localized and directional based damages. So that's going to be useful for sculpting in. But then they've also let rest flat surfaces so they can put more micro details on there. And also at the same time, in the games engine, we often put another layer of micro details on top. And so if we have a noisy sculpt, that's also going to interact with those really bad. So for a newcomer, they would look at a surface like this and say, you know, why haven't you sculpted this surface? It's very much lacking. But what they don't know is that this is for something like a game ready mesh. So they're going to come in here in Substance Painter and start putting unique details and scratches. So to be honest, I even suggest it for the stitches. So in this sculpt, they've put in some individual stitches, but potentially they could have put that in Substance Painter. So it's completely up to the artist, to be honest. If the stitches were in Substance Painter, they'd have far more options. So on that note, there is actually a members video that goes over this sort of process. I forget how many videos we've done here. So the 3 tricks to improve commonly used brushes. This is how you basically do the stitching brushes. So it's like the ultimate way of creating those details inside a Substance. That's why I wouldn't usually use sculpting when it comes to those sorts of things. And also just combining that with Substance Painter techniques is going to have you really, really good. Just on that note as well, the cleanest bake, we also cover how to create zips. So that'll be important for the, those trims that I was talking about. The techniques are in there if you want to learn those. The next question is from Skynezi, and they were asking, based on my experience, is there anything that they should avoid when creating a high poly character to prevent issues during retopology, UV unwrapping, and baking? So it's a really good question, because in the latest videos, I was expressing the details of making sure that you get things right so it doesn't affect the rest of your workflow chain. So what better question than the high poly, because that's where it all basically starts. It'll be different based on every single sculpt, every single character. My general rule of thumb is when you are creating a high poly and you're taking that into a bake, definitely do tessellate it and reduce that. So you're going to have a number of benefits for that. You'll have smaller file sizes, so there's less management costs, and also your bakes are going to be a lot faster. So if imagine you're in there sort of like fixing bakes, and every time you do a rebake, it's going to take longer and longer. So keeping those file sizes quite low is a good idea. In the previous video about low poly retop, we also covered getting rid of rat's nests in the high poly stage. So these are these little pockets when you're doing a high poly that's just going to make your life a living hell when it comes to retopology and baking and stuff. So that's my other really hard tip, is just make sure you don't have those so they don't affect you down the workflow chain. My other tip, and it's also combined with the previous question, is don't create unnecessary detail for yourself inside of the sculpt. So usually when people are sculpting things, they want to showcase that sculpt, the nice ZBrush render to see all the shadows and the details. We've got to swallow that kind of ego, and sometimes the details just aren't going to be in the sculpt, and you want to let it rest and let it be plain, because all these details, like I was saying, they're going to come back later and bite you in the butt. Let's say, for example, you've made some leather like this character, and then suddenly you want to change the style of the leather. You want it to make it more rough, or maybe the art director says that it wants to be a bit harder and smoother so the light can reflect off it and shine, for example. Now, if you've sculpted in all those details, we're not going to be able to go back and sort of like rectify it. We can do it by updating the high poly, but then we have to export the high poly again, rebake it all, and it's just going to cost you a lot of development time, basically. So that's my other tip in the high poly stage. is just don't overdo it with details and really take a step back like the previous question and see what details you're going to be doing in Substance and what are going to be left for the sculpt, basically. So before the final question about optimization versus quality, if you have your own sorts of questions, come into the Discord and chuck them into the monthly question section. I do take questions from members. So if you're interested in that, with watching all the videos that we suggested there, and also be having the ability to ask questions and get works in progress feedback, that definitely is a no-brainer. So click join to see those sorts of perks. These videos about questions and answers are only open for a limited amount of time, and then I put them back into the members library. So if you want to catch up on previous questions and answers, there's definitely lots and lots of content that we go through. Then those are all going to be on a members playlist that you can catch up with. If you're not ready, that's completely okay. There's loads of content to catch up on, also on the public YouTube as well. So this question we're moving on to is asking about poly count limits. So the person made the observation that most characters are sort of like 150k polygons and 10 texture sets. I would potentially suggest that's maybe a couple of years old because the games industry moves so fast. We're now starting to look at about 250k, sometimes even 500, depending on, hair and how big the character is going to be. The texture sets are also getting a lot larger. I've definitely been recently using about 15 to 20. Now that's obviously great for portfolio, but then there's often strict limitations when it comes to the games. So that's completely true. And the question is basically focusing on what's it better to have in the portfolio, an optimized character or something that's really high fidelity. So this is a super good question. And then you're asking from an art lead's perspective, how would I basically look at it? So I'm glad you asked this question because it's really common when I'm looking at stuff. If I'm looking at a portfolio, let's say this one, for example. Now, this is obviously a very high fidelity character, and that's great. The person has artistic skills. They can make hair. I can see that they understand certain elements of skin, prop design and metalwork. However, the thing that's missing from here is a proper breakdown of the low poly retopology, also the texture sheet. So I don't understand if this person is good at game optimization, because game optimization is super important. So look at your best games that you know of, The Last of Us, probably not the best art example, or Red Dead Redemption is like, it feels very good. But when you look into those games, start to look at some assets, you'll see that the quality isn't that high in terms of portfolio. Definitely, if you open up ArtStation, you don't see a list of ArtStation project pieces inside of games like Red Dead Redemption and GTA. They are very basic. So if your focus is really to get a game job, then I suggest focusing on optimization and showcasing that. So a good example are in the ArtStation challenges, and these are the real OGs of game art, because the winners are basically based on how good the game asset is. And you'll often find that there's a full set of wireframes here. We can see the try counts, the normal maps, how they're presenting. So all the judges that are on these panels, they're basically ex or current games industry veterans. And as game industry veterans, we really like portfolio optimization. Definitely as an art director, I basically go straight to looking at topology and texture sheets and trying to understand if this person actually is a game artist at heart. So really good question. Anytime you can show these wireframes and just flexing that you understand those sorts of stuff, it can be really good. Added bonus, if it's a high quality character, then that's just another nail in the coffin for you getting a job. So do try and avoid these kind of just like maximum quality pieces. To be fair, for this artist, they might be going for something different, like real time. But as for your question, yeah, definitely go for closer real production constraints if your target is to go get a job. So great set of questions there, really heavily focused on that sort of UV element and the optimization versus quality, and how we're integrating that across the workflow. If you want to catch up on all the questions and answers, obviously with every single video, there's so many different topics that come out. So follow the playlist and then you can basically start to binge watch those. So thanks for your questions, and I'll catch you on the next one.